Well, hello and welcome again to another episode of Down to Earth but Heavenly Minded. And I'm your host, Risch. You're listening to Internet Radio. But today we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to have a visual. So if you are listening on a computer or phone, you might be able to see what I have here. But we're going to be starting a study in the book of Daniel. And today we're just going to be looking at the outline. And I have the visual on the screen, and it's, like I say, on the book of Daniel. And the man Daniel, and he was a prophet, and he was the fourth in the major prophets listed in the Bible. He belonged to the family of a high rank, and he was taken to Babylon at the age of 16. His whole life, from the time he spent in Babylon, and then he lived a saintly life in an ungodly country. You know, though he belonged to a captive race, he never swayed from devotion and loyalty to God, and he rose to a highest position in the state. He not only was a state servant, but also a prophet of God. And as we shall see, his prophecies deal principally with the Gentiles and are among the most remarkable in the Bible. He was a man of prayer, and he was a man of God. In Jeremiah 25, it shows that he was in bondage, and Jeremiah 29 shows that he was freedom. Well, the book of Daniel, the great mysteries of Matthew 24 and 25, Mark 13, Luke 21, 2 Thessalonians 2, and Revelation can only be unlocked through an understanding of Daniel. Daniel is rightly classified as apocalyptic. In the category, it takes its place with Revelation in the New Testament and Ezekiel and Zechariah in the Old Testament. You know, the word apocalypse means unveiling. Apocalypse and apocalyptics, but pronouncing them right here, express what they saw in the same way as the Lord using parables to explain the mysteries of the kingdom. It is interesting to note that the conditions and the man who wrote the great book of prophecy. Ezekiel was written during the Babylonian captivities. Ezekiel was written in exile with Daniel, and I'm just going to add that he was outside of Babylon, but he was in like a concentration camp. So there was really three prophets, and then you got Jeremiah, who was in Jerusalem itself during this time period. They're all contemporaries. Now, Zechariah was written in a difficult year of restoration. Everyone was trying to hinder the work. Revelation was written when John was banished to the Isle of Patmos, and in all probability worked in the mines there. The church was suffering terrible persecution and did so for 300 years. Daniel was written during the Babylonian captivity. Now, some highlights in the book. In chapter 1, it describes somewhat the life of Daniel in Babylon. In chapter 2, we have Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great image, the image described by Daniel. And then in chapter 3, the image of gold, the fiery furnace. Chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's pride and punishment. Chapter 5, Belshazzar's feast and his downfall. Chapter 6, Daniel in the den of lions. And 7, Daniel's vision of future world history. Chapter 8, the vision of the ram and the goat. And then in chapter 9, we have the prophecy of Daniel's 70th week. And chapter 10, the vision of the glory of God. And in chapter 11 and 12, the history of the world from Darius to the time of the end. The prophecy in the book covers the period from the time of the Gentiles, that is, from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar to the return of the Lord on Mount Olivet. Now, in chapter 1, this chapter is really an introduction to the book, and it explains how Daniel was called to prepare, mature the blessings of God. Now, let's just read verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jeroboam, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jeroboam, king of Judah, into the hands with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Now, these verses give the historical setting. The reason for the captivity was disobedience of the nation. They had forsaken the law and ignored God's commandments. They also had gone into idolatry and brought on moral apostasy. The record of the spiritual decline should be considered by every church and individual. Now, in verses 3 through 7 is the account of some of the Jewish youth who were selected for training, and we are introduced to 4 of them in verse 6. Verse 7, they are given new names. In verse 8 through 10, Daniel's solution. The food were allotted did not meet the requirements of the Mosaic law. Unclean beast. Okay, the wine is probably because it had been offered to idols. Daniel could not accept this and brought his objection to the chief steward. This was an awkward situation for the steward. He could lose his life for not obeying the king's commandment. You got to be pretty careful. And in verse 11 through 14, Daniel requested a 10-day period for himself and the other 3. This was for testing. This the steward consented to do. The others selected the rich food. Daniel and his 3 cohorts had vegetables. Okay, in verse 15 through 16, the end of the test, God honored these for their faithfulness. Their request was granted. In verses 17 through 21, God's blessing continued on them. This test had gone on for 3 years. They were probably now around 20 years old, approximately. The natural abilities far exceeded their contemporaries, and they were 10 times wiser than the king's wisest men. Honor me, and I will honor you. And this is So true, if we honor God. Well, that's kind of the outline of the book and the introduction. So, with that said, I'm just going to end our recording here and we'll go into the study of the book.